Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. My name is Richard Orme from the DAISY Consortium, and I'm your host for today's webinar. Okay, let's get started. The European Accessibility Act is an EU directive that covers a range of products and services, including smartphones, tablets and computers, online shopping websites, mobile applications and e-books. The directive is likely to have broad implications for the publishing industry in Europe and beyond, and clearly the goal is to bring very positive benefits in terms of accessible and inclusive reading for everyone. So let me introduce our expert panel who will explain the Act, explore the implications for organisations in the publishing industry supply chain, describe how publishers' bodies can assist, and we'll hear about some concrete steps that can be taken to get ready. On our panel today, we have Ima Plasencia Porrero, Senior Expert at the European Commission, Kristina Musinelli from Fondazione LIA, also Anne Bergman from the Federation of European Publishers, and we have Luc Audrin, Inclusive Publishing Consultant. Welcome to you all. So a quick overview of today's session. We will hear about introducing the European Accessibility Act, how the publishing industry will need to react and benefits to consumers, helping publishers to understand their obligations, concrete organizational and technical steps, questions and answers, and a discussion. So members of the panel will each speak to an important topic and we'll together address your questions after the presentation. But at this stage, I'll hand over to Ima, who will introduce the Act from the perspective of the European Commission and also tell us about the timeline. Ima.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will try to give you a short overview of the content of the European Accessibility Act in relation to ebooks. So the most relevant elements for the book, while trying to explain the structure of the Act and how it's being organized. So in the Act, we have basically two big pillars, I would say. On the first side, the legislation puts obligations on accessibility to a number of products and services. On the other hand, the same accessibility requirements that are compulsory for products and services are used to render operational the obligations, general obligations of accessibility in other EU law. For example, when public procurement, when buying accessible, or when using European money in some EU funds. And I will explain in the next slide with a little bit more detail which are those products. In the list of products, we have a very strong ICT component, but for the subject matter of today, I would say that what is more relevant is computers, because you can read books in computers, but also dedicated hardware such as e-readers. When it comes to the services, in the next slide, we have a list of ICT-related services, but also transport is included. But there is a specific point on ebooks and their dedicated software. The ebooks, what is an ebook, is being described in the Article 3 of the directive. And it says is a service consisting of the provision of digital files that convey an electronic version of a book that can be accessed, navigated, read and used, and the software including mobile device-based services, including mobile applications dedicated to accessing, navigating, reading and use of those digital files. And it excludes the software covered, of course, in the definition of point 42, which is the dedicated software for the e-reader. Yeah. Now, if I get the next slide, here we can see that if with the public procurement and the EU acts, if a public authority were to buy books, electronic books, those books will have to be accessible. And they will have to be accessible if the purchasing authority will use the accessibility requirements that I'm going to refer to in a second. Then the general obligation to buy accessible will be fulfilled. In the next slide, we have a list of general obligations for products. They relate to, as I said before, the accessibility requirements, but also for all those in the chain of putting products in the market, from manufacturers, importers, distributors, and so forth. Products gets a CE marking, and this would be very relevant for the e-readers because they will have all the actors in the chain will have to address them. And their accessibility will be declared by as a first instance, declared by the economic operator. In the next slide, we have the obligations for services. So this would be for ebooks. So if you fulfill the obligations, the accessibility obligations, then you immediately get access to the whole internal market. This is what we call the free movement of products and services. And this is very important because it would be clear in Europe what needs to be done in order to have accessible ebook in the market. Now, the obligations are placed on service providers, and there will be also a list of authorities that are going to be responsible for complying and checking the compliance with those services. In the directive, the directive in a recital clarifies that the concept of service provider could include a publisher or other economic operators involved in the distribution of these books. In the next slide, what we point out here is that there are some exemptions for organizations providing services, for economic operators providing services. Microenterprises are exempted. They don't have the obligation to comply with the accessibility requirements of the directive. And there are two safeguards important to mention. One is disproportionate burden, meaning that the obligations on accessibility apply as long as they do not impose a disproportionate burden in the economic operator, and fundamental alteration. So if you are in this case, if you are making electronic books, nobody is asking you to make paper books, for example, printed Braille books. It is electronic books that have to be accessible. So the nature, the character of your service in this case can be preserved. In the next slide, what I try to put here is that the directive allows to go into a little bit more of detail into the accessibility requirements by using standards or technical specifications. The possibility is there and the Commission can choose, but it is not yet decided what steps will be put forward. But the idea is that standards and technical specifications, by providing more detail, can facilitate the implementation of the directive. In the next slide, what we have is, I've put a summary of the main enforcement chain or elements of the chain of enforcement of the directive. This means that we start in a soft way. Economic operators first declare that they comply with the accessibility requirements when placing their service, in this case, the ebooks, in the market. Then we have authorities at member states that have to check compliance. They can also receive complaints, for example. But ultimately, we have got the possibility for consumers to take actions before the court. And in those actions, not only individuals, which are a consumer, but also public bodies that have got an interest may engage. To that end, the enforcement requires that if there is non-compliance, penalties that are effective, proportionate, and dissuasive can be put, and also remedial actions. The idea is to remedy the accessibility and not to just get a penalty. In the next slide, I've summarized the annexes that the directive contain. The first and most relevant technical annex for today is Annex 1, that contains all the accessibility requirements. And those requirements are some general requirements for all services, but some specific requirements for ebooks. And those are in section 4 of Annex 1. They relate to ensuring that when an ebook contains an audio in addition to text, they are synchronized. It contains requirements to ensure that the software or the digital file of the ebook does not prevent assistive technology from working properly, that there would be allowing alternative renditions so that the content of the book is perceivable, understandable, operable, and robust, that the metadata is discoverable, that containing the accessibility features, and ensuring that the digital rights management measures do not block accessibility features. I mean, I just mentioned there very quickly. Then we have an annex with examples, and the other annexes relate to the built environment, conformity assessment, and the last annex, the assessment of disproportionate burden. So if you were a company, an organization, a service provider that puts ebooks in the market, you would look into Annex 1 to see what are the accessibility requirements, and you would go, if you run into problems because of proportionality, then you would be able to get more information in Annex 6 on how far your obligations go. The last slide relates to the transposition, to the implementation period. The directive, that by the way has got the number 2019-882, had 3 years of transposition from the moment it entered into force. It entered into force last year, June, so we have got a total of 3 years until 2023. And then we have another 3 years of 4 applications. So first, the member states have to convert the text of the directive in a national law, and then the directive would be applicable in 2025. Sorry, I made a mistake. It was the transitional period ends in 2022. I think I said 23, it's 22. So 22, important date, June. National laws should be ready. 2025, the directive is applicable, so the obligations have to be there. There are some transitional periods that are not so relevant for ebooks, but I wanted you to have the main provisions of the directive in this summary. So we have 2 years left for finalizing the national transposition, and then additional 3 years for making, placing in the market books, ebooks that are accessible from the beginning. I thank you for your attention.
Emma, thank you very much for all that wonderful information. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions when we get to the end of our presentations, but at this point, Kristina, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Secretary General of LIA Foundation. We offer services and support to the publisher to adopt accessibility. I've been asked to provide an overview on how publishing industry need to react to this new legislation and which could be the benefit to the consumer. There are so many different points of view. So one is from the publisher and the other actor in the value chain. I think that it's really important to comply with legislation for many different reasons. One is to make the effort visible, to embrace accessibility as an important step for a publishing house, is a strategic goal. And so it's really important that all the activity and the effort done can become visible to all the other actors in the value chain, but especially for the end user. it's important, and it's important also to describe the compliance with the requirement. As Imma explained, there are some technical requirements, and so it will be very important to have a clear description of what you are doing, either in a statement that you put on website, but also in a detailed description of every title that you publish and describe which are the accessibility features. There are two other important elements to embrace accessibility and to be compliant with the European Accessibility Act. First of all, because accessibility means higher quality. If you produce accessible website or content, the quality of the product and the service that you offer to all the user is higher. And especially for what is related with website and platform and so on, you also have another additional advantage, that is the search engine optimization is better for everyone. So I think it's accessibility also brings some other added value that are not so usually know, that I think it would be very important to take in consideration. There are the legal point of view. You need to be complying with legal and technical requirements, and you would like to avoid enforcement and penalty, especially when there are in place at national or European level surveillance authorities. And for end user, the benefit of the implementation of the Accessibility Act is to have equal access and equal opportunity to read any book and any publication that is published on the European market, and not only on the European market, because the Accessibility Act is to the European Accessibility Act need to comply also all the other international organizations who want to sell or distribute title in Europe. So also international organizations should comply with the requirement. And this means that the person may access, even if they are visually impaired or dyslexic or have some physical disability, to the same title in the same time with the same reading solution and through the same platform. And this is important for the Accessibility Act, but is also important for the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities that is cited in the European Accessibility Act. This really means that we in the next few years need to create a fully accessible digital ecosystem where all the elements of the process that the person should do to access a digital content should be become accessible. That means the devices, but also the application, the distribution chain, and also the payment and the e-commerce website. We as Fondazione LIA have published a paper, and we tried to describe in a schema all the role that every different actor should play, and which are the specific requirements that every actor should comply. So if you move to the next slide, please. So we try to consider all the actors, so publisher and in general content creator, digital distributor or aggregators, books in print catalog, digital bookstore or digital library, because as you may access the title in a bookstore, you may also would like to have the digital lending opportunity, and the reading solution. What I think it's really very important is for the publisher is to produce born accessible publication following guidelines that are in line with the technical requirement. They should check the accessibility of their file, or they may ask to someone third party to check the accessibility and certify the accessibility of what they have produced. And they also need to create metadata. Imma cited metadata, and metadata really, really important, because metadata are the information that let end user able to understand if the publication is fitting their needs or not. For digital distributor aggregator, is important to understand accessibility, for two reasons. They need to distribute accessible content, so they need to know if the content produced by the publisher is accessible or not, and this is where a certification and metadata become important. And they don't have to use accessibility DRM who impede accessibility. Some of the actual the DRM that are actually used don't let visually impaired people to access the content, and so they cannot use the bright display or the screen reader to access the content. So this will be something that should be considered in the next few years. Books in printed catalog, it's important because they can be the source of reference for all the accessibility title available in the market. And I think this is quite important, especially so that people can have a unique access and understand which are all the titles available in accessible format. Digital bookstore and digital library need to have a graphical interface and a website that should be fully accessible. They should display the metadata to end user, and they also should display the accessibility metadata to search engine, so end user can either go to a bookstore and find the book, but also go and search in Google or in other search engine and find the information they want and try to understand if the title is available in an accessible format. And the same is for reading solution, where the software should, even it's a platform of a publisher where the reading solution is in a web browser or in an app, like an iPhone or Android cell phone, either they all need to be accessible. And also in this case, they should not use blocking DRM, and they also in this case, they should display the accessibility metadata. What does it mean to move to accessible publication? What is really important is to move to the design for all concept that in the publishing industry is the born accessible definition. That means adopt international standard to create accessible ebooks and website and app since the first publication, not remediate them after, but start thinking in an accessible way. Define a procedure, internal or external, to check and certify accessibility, and provide to the end user, using the already existing metadata schema, a friendly description of the accessibility feature and make them, this metadata flow along the value chain. And if you have a platform or a website, it's really important also to provide information about the accessibility of the services that you offer to your end user. And there are already some standards that are used in the publishing industry at international level. They are mainly based on the W3C WCAG, and they cover the format of the file, the website, and the reading solution. And for the metadata schema, there are two different metadata schema. One is Onyx, that is the metadata used normally along the value chain in the commercial environment. And in Onyx, there is a specific code list describing all the accessibility feature, but there is also another set of metadata that is schema.org that can be embedded inside the EPUB file and then can be used to show the accessibility information, for example, in a reading solution or in a search engine. So I think that what is really important in the next year is try to implement all this information, and because what is really needed, it's almost here. And so what is really important is start now, because 2025 is, there are 3 or 4 years, but you need to make a process to achieve all this stuff in this period. Thank you very much.
Kristina, thank you. Your messages start now. Let's now hear from Anne Bergman, who will tell us about how the Federation of European Publishers are helping publishers to understand their obligations. Anne.
Thank you and good afternoon. I just wanted to say a few words. First of all, I'm very honored to be in such a distinguished company between Ima, Kristina, and Luc, who are true experts in accessibility. Within FEP, the Federation of European Publishers, which is a gathering of 29 publisher associations across Europe, we are trying our utmost to raise awareness within the publishing community and beyond on the necessity to work, as Kristina and Luc were explaining, as early as possible in the publishing process, so that more books are becoming accessible even before the deadline of 2025. Can I have the next slides, please? So, and how are we doing that? We are doing it via events at book fairs. Well, we may have skipped a few because book fairs haven't happened in the last months, but we hope that they'll come back quickly. And we are looking into doing something at the Frankfurt Book Fair. We are also part of a network, the Aldous network, and I'll say a few words about that afterwards. And also we'll be talking with booksellers and technology vendors, both at book fairs, but at other industry events. And why do we need to raise awareness? Well, I think it was fairly clear from Ima's presentation that we have legal obligation to do so, but we also believe we have social obligation. And the second reason would be that for book publishers, their main role is to find audiences for authors, and of course with more accessibility we can have larger audiences. Can I have the next slide, please? So Aldous, this is a project that unites book fairs around Europe, and it's co-funded by European Money, the Creative Europe program. The accessibility part of the Aldous Up, it's Aldous Up this time, is led by Leah. So Kristina could have spoken about this, but she kindly let me do it. So there will be a study on the accessibility of the book fairs, and of course that study is meant to provide guidelines for book fairs to be more accessible. I think really important for publishers, there will be accessibility camp. That means that we will be able to organize events where publishers and other stakeholders will be invited to come and better understand what they need to do to have their production made accessible. It's a really important element that you put people into a active environment, and then we'll keep on having events on accessibility during the book fairs, virtually, physically, or at other occasions. Can I have the next slides? So that was the how, and now the why. Well, as I say, the European Accessibility Act puts an obligation on publisher to make their content accessible, but it's also will provide us with larger audience. We are well aware that the more a book is accessible, the better it performs, not just for people who need that accessibility, but for all readers. So it's a better, if I may say, I hate the word product for books, but it's a better product. There will be also more people able to access directly our books, so it won't require that we go via third parties for people to read our books. So that's really important to increase the audience of the books. Also, there's another piece of legislation. It's an international treaty, but it's been implemented in the European law. That is the Marrakesh Treaty. And if a book is not accessible, then authorized entity can use the non-accessible version of the book and make it accessible. If we make all, or I suppose nearly all books accessible, then we can work with authorized entity, and they can invest their time and resources to make more difficult books. There are books which will be very difficult for publishers to make accessible. That's the disproportionate burden which is within the text of the directive. So for those authorized entity, they can invest their time and resources to make those books which will require more expert knowledge. So I think that with all that, we can address the concerns of a lot of our stakeholders, and we'll keep on working. We keep on saying that 2025 is tomorrow. And with the COVID, we say that the ebooks have gained a lot of new readers. So hopefully this is going to be playing as an incentive for all of us to achieve more accessibility. And I think that's the end of my slides.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now we'll hear from Luc, who is an inclusive publishing consultant and has worked for so many years within the publishing industry on accessibility and on other issues. So from someone who's been in the trenches, let's hear about concrete organizational and technical steps. So Luc.
Hello everybody. Thank you, Richard. Yes, I've been working for years in large publishing houses and implementing accessibility in the organization. So I would like to emphasize the organizational steps that are really important to take right now to start to enable accessibility on all the supply chain, and particularly starting from the publishing houses, the content production, and then also to all the next steps of the supply chain. We already told that, but raising awareness is the very first thing to start now. It's an important step because it's easy to get some information from blind associations and everybody from like Foundation Leah or a consultant like me to explain to the editorial team what it means to read a book when you are blind or when you have low vision. So this awareness should be brought to executive people so that they understand the market issues with this new accessibility, born accessible ebooks, but also to the publishing teams where they have to consider particularly image description. And this is done in our organizations by building a team. You have to get some champions who will bring this issue as a flag for the whole organization. And this will help building guidelines for all the team, or also know where to find resources. Because there are resources, there are charters, there are technical standards, and also organizations that help. But internally, any size of the company, someone has to get this subject. And also, what is really, really effective is not to have such higher expectation that nothing is possible. We should have this progressive approach that enables to first to do some steps with existing standard, existing production, existing also supplier who master the skills that are needed to bring these born accessible ebooks. And these steps by step process enables to understand through the next years what is at stake, and allow us in the end to be fully compliant to the European Accessibility Act. What is also very effective is to have some people really understanding the technical side and specifying how the files have to be produced, how the metadata have to be encoded. And these people should be different from the production department who are buying the production to suppliers, because this helps to enrich all the supply chain within, inside and outside with suppliers. That's for organization, and technically, the next slide. So the technical side is has been also already explained by Kristina, but there is one thing very innocent to say, that it's go digital. Every book that is not digital cannot be accessible to blind people. So one very important solution is EPUB 3. EPUB 2 should be let aside because it's a legacy format. EPUB 3 does what EPUB 2 is able to do, but it does it better. And mainly it does it with accessibility. There are some very important stakeholders in this area, some very important organizations that are working on accessibility for years, like the DAISY Consortium, who is implied in the web accessibility and now also the ebook accessibility. So support the DAISY Consortium is the way to have a very effective relation to technical specifications, and also to benefit from some tools that the DAISY Consortium is writing. EDR Lab is a development laboratory in Europe with international view, and EDR Lab is contributing a lot to making products and reading solutions accessible. So it's an important actor here, and EDR Lab organizes each year a digital publishing summit where accessibility is one of the main theme during the summit. There is also obviously Foundation LIA that is here represented by Kristina, and also there are many resources at Accessible Book Consortium in WIPO. And from these people, we benefit some free tools like EPUB Check. EPUB Check is a very important tool. It's not a tool that measures accessibility, but obviously an EPUB file is accessible when it's first valid. If it's not valid, it cannot be accessible. So EPUB Check is a very important tool, and it's a tool that is supported by international fundraising, and this makes us benefit of a checker that it gets free, that we can get for free. Accessibility Checker for EPUB is a very interesting tool developed by DAISY Consortium, who can check the technical part of accessibility. It cannot say everything, but you are at least sure that there are no evident errors. So Accessibility Checker for EPUB is very important too. It's a very concrete tool. And as I said, Radium SDK developed by EDR Lab is also the best engine to display accessible ebooks now. So to finish my part, I would like to let you grab these links to these important organizations. In Italy, you have Foundation LIA. In France, the group Normes Standard from the Syndicat National de l'Édition has been working on this subject for years, for 3 years now, and there are many resources here. And you have also links to EDR Lab, DAISY Consortium, and ABC. Obviously, you may also have very interesting conversations and help and resources with the European Blind Union and European Disability Forum and your local visually impaired people associations, where they are really interested in this project. So it's very interesting that you meet them and you build awareness in your company. Thank you.
Luke, thank you. And just to assure people that the slide deck will be made available with these links in it, and we'll also extract the links with this great list of links to resources. We'll extract them from the deck and provide them on our resources page. And we have around 15 minutes for questions and answers, and we have plenty of questions lined up. I tried to group these into themes, and the first question is around the theme of time, and you referred to this, Anne, in your last piece. I don't know who would like to pick up the question. It is, well, is there any risk to the timetables that IMA set out, the timescale, with the COVID crisis? Is there any risk that any of these timescales will slip?
Maybe I can answer. I suppose in terms of legislation, of course not. In terms of the possibility of investment from publisher, it will be more complicated. You are aware that the crisis is hitting publishing industry quite hard. This is why I think that the faster we can agree on what the technical specification will be, the better it is for all, because seems to me that if we are able to, if we are investing in making books accessible, we should be have quasi-certainty that this will be the technical specification of the future.
Great. And another time question, this one from Gabrielle. Will the Act apply to books that were published before 2025?
Yes, the Act applies to services when services are delivered. So if you deliver an ebook service, then that book will have to be accessible. If you have an old file and you don't deliver that file, I mean, if it was already delivered, that's fine. But if you are delivering a file as it will be a new file, a new delivery, and then it would be, it will have to be accessible.
May I add something? This is why I suggest to start moving now, because if you start moving now, all the titles that you publish from now until 25, they should be already accessible. And so when you have to publish them, they will already comply with the requirement.
Thank you. I have a question now from Andre, which is, does this legislation apply to website versions of books or perhaps database book products?
It's not easy to say yes, no, just like that, without really understanding and knowing what exactly is the book or the type of file that you are referring to. But we have, as I said, a clear definition of what an ebook is. And if that type of ebook that you mentioned, or that type of file that you mentioned, could be considered as an ebook because it falls under the definition that we have in Article 3, then yes, it will be covered. If it is different, not. But let me clarify one thing that I didn't mention also, and that is that websites where the ebooks are going to be placed or sold will have to be accessible, because we have among the services that the directive also covers are e-commerce. So if you would have an e-commerce platform delivering or ebooks, that website will also have to be accessible.
This is why we spoke about the overall value chain and not only from the publisher point of view. And if you read the directive, it's clearly described which are the interconnection between the different actors. We try to simplify in the schema, but there are some kind of interconnection between the publisher, the distributor, the e-commerce website, and this is why we need to consider the value chain and the ecosystem, not only the single element.
Thank you. I have 3 questions in a theme here, so I'll try to group them. One version of the question is, does any equivalent legislation exist elsewhere in the world, and what were the lessons from that? And then a couple of linked questions. How do these regulations differ or align with the UK's current Public Sector Bodies Act? And I guess the same question, could you please summarize any differences between the European Accessibility Act and the most recent UK's regulations from 2018? So similarities to existing legislation elsewhere, and we've recently got some legislation in the UK. Is this something that is seen as very similar to this, reaches further? Maybe Emma, could you speak to this?
Yes. Well, I don't know exactly which UK legislation you refer to, so so I do not dare to say to make that comparison. What I can tell you is that the Accessibility Act has been crafted to take on board existing requirements on accessibility across that were existing in other places. And I could refer, for example, to the in Europe, for example, to the procurement legislation in Italy on the Stanca law, which specifically referred to ebooks. Also, when you see the requirements that we have there in terms of perceivable, understandable, operable, and robust, those are related to the web's accessibility W3C requirements. So meaning trying to align. When you come to there are some member states that address, for example, the issue of accessible educational books at international level, for example. That is the case in the US. And so you cannot compare, let's say, the strictly the Accessibility Act with other pieces of legislation, because what we have done is here put together bits and pieces that were around floating in other nationals and national and regional legislations. But whenever there was something, we tried really to, let's say, not to reinvent the wheel, and to complement what was available on one hand and be compatible with what was also there.
Thank you. And so some questions about really, hard decisions here. So one question from Marianne is, let's say theoretically, a publisher produces a new book after 2025 and the ebook is not accessible. What will happen? Will they get a penalty? And who would give them the penalty? How would that mechanism work? A linked question that's moved off my screen was, will there be some kind of EU level mark, like an CE marking or some kind of standard for this, which would give all parties clarity about whether or not passes or does not pass the kind of accessibility bar? And then lastly, from Christine, which authority will decide when an ebook is accessible? Is that the Commission? Is that a national authority? And when would there be specifications, really clear specifications that publishers and others in the publishing value chain know what they need to do? Lots of questions in there. Let's hear from Luke as well on this one.
Yes, about the specifications, there are some specifications that we use in the publishing industry. It's called EPUB accessibility. It has EPUB specific accessibility features, but of course, as EPUB is based on HTML for the content, it is based on WCAG for the content. So the specifications are well known, I would say, and available. Those we use in the industry. Of course, the European Accessibility Act speaks about a future standard or European technical specification. It's not decided yet which is it. which it is, but we certainly hope that all the work that has been done by the publishing industry to bring born accessible ebooks with using EPUB accessibility specifications will be preserved for the future.
Yeah. May I complement the answer?
Please do, because there were about 4 questions in one there.
Yes,
So.
yes. Okay. So the compliance of services. So there will not be a CE marking. CE marking is for products. That's to be very clear, not for services. So ebooks do not need to have an E marking. The directive does not require that. Now, how is the enforcement working? First of all, and who is checking? Member states have to establish what we have called authorities that are going to be checking compliance of services. So there will be a national authority that will be regularly checking. The directive requires member states to implement and periodically update procedures that ensure, or in order to check compliance with of the services with the requirements of the directive, to follow up on complaints received by users when there is non-compliance with the accessibility requirements, and to verify that the economic operator, in this case the service provider that is involved, whether it's the publisher, for example, has taken the necessary corrective measures. So the member states have to designate this authority that has to do this procedure. So this is the second step on the enforcement. So the first step is the economic operator declare that they comply with the accessibility requirements of the directive. Then we have these authorities at national level that are going to be checking. If this does not work properly, or there is a consumer or a person with a disability or an organization that thinks that, okay, that have checked the ebooks and they say they are not compliant, they can take action on and go to court. And as I said, the intention is that there are corrective. This is really in the nature of the directive. The first thing is to have corrective measures, so to be sure that the breach of accessibility is corrected. But if that is not the case, it's possible in court to put penalties that are, as I mentioned before, they are effective, proportionate, and dissuasive.
That they are asking if there are already some requirement. As Luke explained, some of the standards that are already used by the publisher are already in line with the requirement. But if you want to have a look, there is a specific part of the directive where you can find the high-level requirement to understand which are the specifications that are needed, that are more or less the same that are already available in the EPUB accessibility guidelines.
Great. We're really coming towards the end now. I'm going to see if I can squeeze in some quick questions with quick-fire answers, because people have taken the trouble to ask the questions. So from Enrico, a further clarification on the cutoff date. So I think we covered this. If an ebook is for sale already before June 2025, does it need to be accessible after that date? Looking for a confirmation on that question.
I think it will create a lot of problem, if I may. It's Anne. And we will need to be discussing with the member states for books which were published even before the directive was adopted. And until we have the technical specification, this is going to make it difficult.
Okay. No one else on that? Then I'll move to the next question, which is from Kiersey, which is, does this legislation apply to the systems that are used maybe by public libraries who offer ebook lending services? This feels like a straightforward public procurement question.
It's only for commercial operators.
So this could be a public procurement, so in a public library?
So, Indeed, so that you have two legs in the directive. One is directly for commercial. So if you provide the service of providing ebooks, and normally it's a service for remuneration, then you will have to. But if you are a public library that buy books then already you are obliged to buy accessible. Or whether you get EU money funding, then you would need to get to respect accessibility. So the answer is depends on the situation.
Yeah, sounds like yes, but from different angles. Is that right?
Yeah.
Great.
But there will be cases where it's a no, okay?
Okay. All right. All right. Well, coming to the end of this session, Emma, Kristina, Anne, and Luke, thanks for sharing great information and insights. Thank you to everyone who joined us for today's session. Coming up in the next few weeks, we have some more wonderful topics for you. On June the 17th, in response to many requests for this topic, we have Describing Images in Publications, Guidance, Best Practice, and the Promise of Technology. And on June the 24th, we have another highly requested topic, Metadata in Publishing, the Hidden Information Essential for Accessibility. And on July the 1st, we'll hear about initiatives that are underway in different regions of the world to bring about accessible publishing to a reality. We'll contrast these different approaches, and I anticipate an interesting discussion on which will be the most successful mode in our world tour of inclusive publishing initiatives. As always, you can find out more information at daisy.org/webinars. I hope you'll join us again next week. In the meantime, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.